Chapter 9, in which a lady's insight pierces through years of academic armour. Crispin watched the polite applause ripple through the chart room with the satisfaction of a conductor who'd delivered a particularly well-executed finale. His argument had been airtight, his delivery precise. The small audience might not have been what he'd hoped for, but they'd been attentive enough, and really, quality over quantity had always been his preference. "Questions?" he asked, allowing exactly the right note of invitation into his voice. Not too eager, not too dismissive. It was a balance he'd spent a career perfecting. An elderly gentleman in the front row immediately raised his hand. Crispin recognized the type instantly. The technician. Retired engineer or doctor, the sort who read historical fiction for the battles and technical specifications of 19th century artillery.
Dr. Shrike, your description of research methods for Trafalgar Tide was fascinating. How long did you spend in the Naval Archives?
4 months at Greenwich, another 2 at Portsmouth. Crispin relaxed into the familiar rhythm of this answer. The Admiralty records are remarkably complete, though one does need to develop a tolerance for 18th century handwriting and the occasional weevil damage. A polite chuckle from the audience. This was his element, the gentle humour, the specific details that suggested vast knowledge held gracefully in reserve. A woman near the middle, pearls and a cruise ship tan, raised her hand next. The devotee. Simpler still. Reassurance and a charming smile would suffice.
When can we expect your Cameron book? I do so enjoy your work.
You're very kind. I'm aiming for this spring, though my editor might have other... His voice caught. Good God. The Valkyrie from the harbour. The blonde photographer was still there, that expensive camera resting in her lap, its lens aimed at him like an accusation. He'd been peripherally aware of her throughout his talk. Impossible to miss, really, with her barely concealed hostility radiating from the back row. She'd been photographing him with an intensity that felt less like documentation and more like target practice. But only now did the pieces fall into place. Sydney Cove, yesterday morning. The photographer at the harbour whose shot he'd ruined by stepping into frame at precisely the wrong moment. He'd tried to make conversation about Fort Denison. She'd been thoroughly unimpressed, and he'd retreated to the Park Hyatt feeling like a schoolboy who'd been caught pulling pigtails. She had mentioned something about being on the ship, the port side. As it happened, his cabin was on the port side, fairly high up in a Princess Grill suite, 7068, quite a roomy affair, and doubtless this colonial camera woman was somewhere a lot closer to steerage class beside the anchor chain or something. Other ideas, he finished, recovering smoothly. The research phase is nearly complete. Now comes the rather more challenging task of arranging facts into something resembling a narrative. Brilliant. I've managed to offend her twice in as many days. First by ruining her photograph, now by demolishing her entire artistic philosophy. Another question came from somewhere in the middle rows, something about his writing routine that he could answer in his sleep. As he responded, explaining his monastic schedule with enough humour to avoid sounding completely tedious, he kept one eye on the photographer. She was looking directly at him now, her blue eyes sharp, with something beyond mere professional disagreement. This was personal. Her hand was moving, lifting slowly, deliberately, like someone raising a flag of war. Right, he thought, wrapping up his answer about morning writing habits. Prepare for the lecture on post-colonial theory or the tyranny of the author. I'll give her my art as servant to history line. That should put a pin in it. Yes, he said, nodding toward her with what he hoped was magnanimous patience. The lady with the camera. She stood, and he was struck again by her presence. Tall, athletic, with the particular Australian confidence that seemed to come from a country where everything could kill you, but probably wouldn't bother. The same woman who'd promised to toss him in the harbour. The room turned to look at her.
You speak of duty to the past.
She began, her accent cutting through the room's genteel atmosphere like a knife through butter. Her voice was clear, carrying with no hint of nervousness. He braced himself for the attack, for the clever skewering he probably deserved.
Do you ever feel that the ghosts of the people you write about are disappointed in you?
The question hung in the air. He felt his smile freeze on his face.
Not for getting the facts wrong,
She continued, those unblinking blue eyes fixed on him.
but for not living your own life with the passion they were denied.
The room went absolutely silent. For a moment, Crispin's mind simply stopped, like a pocket watch dropped in water. The carefully prepared arsenal of rebuttals, the quick academic wit, the polished deflections, all of it vanished. Gone. She knows. The thought arrived with the force of a physical blow. She bloody well knows. How does she know? He could almost see them now, his subjects, the people he'd spent years studying. Mary Hillier, Cameron's housemaid, standing at the back of the chart room with her arms folded, looking at him with that same patient disappointment he'd seen in the photographs. The chimney sweep James Hodges, soot-stained and ancient at 15, asking what he'd done with all his comfortable, safe years. The factory workers Cameron had photographed, their defiant stares asking why he was wasting his life on theirs. Cowardice, his mind supplied, clear and cold. That's what they'd call it. You've made a career of cataloguing other people's bravery, while cultivating none of your own. Someone in the front row coughed. The sound seemed to come from very far away. He realized he'd been staring at her, his mouth slightly open, for what must have been 5 full seconds. The elderly gentleman was looking between them with confusion. The woman with the pearls had leaned forward with the avid interest of someone watching a motorway pile up. Say something, anything. His throat felt like sandpaper. Well! The word came out slightly too loud, slightly too bright. He ran a hand through his hair, felt it stick up at an angle he couldn't correct. That's certainly a pivot from, 18th century naval administration, isn't it, The laugh was ghastly even to his own ears. Stop talking, regroup, find your footing. But his mouth kept moving, words tumbling out in an increasingly desperate attempt to sound thoughtful, rather than utterly demolished. Disappointed? The ghosts? One. Must maintain a certain professional, a hermeneutic distance, if you will. He was gesturing now, hands moving in vague academic shapes. To project one's own passions onto the historical subject would be, well, a rather egregious category error, wouldn't it? A failure of method. Failure of life, you fraud. Failure of nerve. She's seen straight through you and you're babbling about hermeneutics like a complete. So no, I shouldn't think they're disappointed. His voice had taken on a slightly manic quality. Perhaps bemused by the central heating. One imagines Victorian housemaids would find central heating rather, what was the question again? A painful silence. Oh yes, passion, right. He cleared his throat, tried for a dismissive smile. Jolly good. Next question. The words fell into the room like stones down a well. The photographer was still standing, still watching him with those unsettlingly direct eyes. Her expression wasn't triumphant. It wasn't even particularly sympathetic. She looked evaluative, as if she'd asked an exam question and was waiting to see if he'd pass or fail. Then, without a word, she sat down. The deputy festival organizer, Claire, stepped forward with a bright, desperate smile that suggested she'd witnessed something far too intimate for a public lecture.
Well, that was thought-provoking. Any other questions for Dr. Shrike?
A tentative hand rose somewhere in the middle rows, but Crispin barely registered it. Thank you, Claire, he said, more sharply than he'd intended. I think that's all we have time for today. The audience recognized a dismissal when they heard one. They began gathering their things with the particular rustling efficiency of people grateful to escape an awkward situation. A few approached the front. God, not now. Please, not now. To thank him, to get books signed, to ask the safe questions that didn't threaten to reorganize one's entire understanding of oneself. He dealt with them on autopilot. His academic persona reasserted itself enough to be charming, to sign his name with a flourish, to make the appropriate noises of gratitude. But his attention kept drifting to the back of the room. The photographer had slung her camera bag over her shoulder and was making her way to the door. She moved with purpose, with that same athletic efficiency he'd noticed at the harbour. She paused at the threshold, looked back. Their eyes met across the length of the chart room. There was no understanding in her gaze, no sympathy. Only a cool, appraising look, as if she'd identified a problem and was waiting to see what he'd do about it. Then she was gone. The last of the audience members drifted away, the room emptied, the air conditioning hummed. Through the portholes the Pacific rolled on, indifferent and eternal. Crispin stood at the lectern, his neat stack of notes still perfectly aligned, his carefully prepared lecture intact, but somehow utterly irrelevant. His hands were shaking. He grabbed the bottle of water that Claire had placed beside the microphone and drained it in 3 long gulps. The water was lukewarm and slightly plasticky, but it gave him something to do with his hands. Claire was still there, gathering up the festival pamphlets that someone had left on a chair. She glanced up at him with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes.
Well done, Crispin. That was certainly memorable.
He managed what he hoped was a nonchalant laugh. That didn't go too badly, did it? I thought she was going to start throwing things at me. Lucky it was just a question, what? His voice sounded false even to himself, too jovial, too bright. Claire gave him a look that suggested she wasn't fooled in the slightest.
She's quite something, isn't she? The photographer. Very direct.
Yes, direct. He set down the empty water bottle with exaggerated care. Right. Well, I have some notes to review before tonight's debate. It was a transparent excuse, and they both knew it.
Of course.
Claire picked up her stack of pamphlets.
See you at dinner.
Absolutely, wouldn't miss it. She left and he was finally mercifully alone. Crispin sank into the nearest chair, not the one behind the lectern where he'd held court, but one in the front row, the elderly gentleman's seat. He sat heavily, feeling every one of his years. His reflection stared back at him from the polished wood of a cabinet across the room. Tweed jacket, sensible haircut, the very picture of a respectable academic. Do you ever feel that the ghosts of the people you write about are disappointed in you? The question wouldn't leave him alone. It circled in his mind like a shark. He thought of Mary Hillier, who'd allowed Cameron to photograph her dozens of times, who'd trusted the artist with her image, her vulnerability, her truth. What would she make of Crispin, who'd spent 2 years researching her life, but couldn't muster the courage to examine his own? He thought of the factory workers, the street urchins, all the people Cameron had immortalized. They'd lived with such intensity, despite poverty, despite hardship, despite everything. And what had Crispin done with his privilege, his education, his comfortable middle-class safety? Wake at 5, write until noon, research in the afternoon, dinner with the wife, bed by 10. A life as precisely ordered as a footnote. The thought arrived unbidden. I've turned myself into a machine for processing other people's passions while cultivating none of my own. He put his head in his hands. The worst part, the absolutely devastating part, was that the photographer had seen it. A stranger, a colonial with a camera and an alarming talent for looking straight through pretense. She'd seen him, truly seen him, in a way that no one had in, God, how long? Years? Decades? His wife certainly hadn't seen him in years. Hadn't really looked since he couldn't remember when. His colleagues saw Dr. Crispin Shrike, the successful author, the festival fixture. His readers saw the polished prose, the impeccable research. But this woman, this photographer who he'd met for all of 5 minutes at Sydney Harbour and offended twice in as many days, had looked at him and seen a hollow man. How? The question was almost a physical ache. How did she see that? He needed to know. The need was sudden and overwhelming, not romantic or heroic, but desperate, almost primal. He needed to find her, to understand what she'd seen, how she'd known. Because if she could see the problem that clearly, perhaps she could see... See what? A solution, a way forward, absolution. He didn't know. That was the terrifying part. Crispin stood up, straightened his jacket and walked to the nearest porthole. The ocean stretched to the horizon, vast and indifferent. Somewhere on this ship was a woman who'd taken apart his entire life with a single question. And he had absolutely no idea what to do about it. What have I done with my life? The question hung in the empty chart room, unanswered and unanswerable as the Queen Elizabeth sailed on into the endless blue.